Kindness will not save your career here. Richard Harrington's voice crossed the marble lobby with enough cold authority to make two nearby employees stop what they were doing. Grace Miller slowly stood beside an elderly woman whose leather travel bag had opened near the front desk, scattering a scarf, reading glasses, medication pouch, and several personal items across the polished floor. Grace had stepped away from her station for less than a minute to help gather them. To Richard, that minute was enough. At 54, Richard owned the Harrington Grand, one of Boston's most prestigious luxury hotels, and he carried himself like a man who believed every second inside it belonged to him. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver-streaked hair carefully arranged, and 3 executives stood behind him waiting to continue their morning inspection. Grace held the woman's glasses out with both hands. "Here you are, ma'am." The woman smiled with visible relief. "Thank you, sweetheart." Grace returned the smile before turning toward Richard. She was 25, quietly spoken, simply dressed, and so unassuming that many guests remembered her kindness long before they remembered her name. Richard glanced toward the unattended station. "Why did you leave your position?" "She needed help, sir." Richard's expression did not change. "Your responsibility was the desk." Grace looked toward the elderly guest, who was still arranging her belongings. It only took a moment. One executive lowered his eyes. Another pretended to study the lobby. Richard stepped closer, keeping his voice controlled. "This is a 5-star hotel, Miss Miller. Guests expect precision, professionalism, discipline." Grace nodded. "Yes, sir. Kindness does not replace professionalism." The words settled into the lobby. Grace's cheeks warmed, but she did not argue. She simply returned to the elderly woman, made certain the bag was securely closed, and carried it the final few feet to a nearby chair. Richard watched with restrained irritation. He had spent nearly 30 years turning one struggling family hotel into a successful hospitality company. He understood occupancy rates, operating margins, premium service, and reputation. He believed excellence came from standards that never bent. What he had forgotten was that hotels existed because people walked through their doors carrying more than luggage. Grace understood that without ever being taught. She noticed the nervous traveler arriving alone after midnight. She remembered which elderly guests needed extra time at the desk. She knew the names of housekeepers Richard had passed hundreds of times without recognizing. None of this impressed him. Not yet. "Miss Miller," Richard said as Grace returned to her station, "next time, stay where you are assigned." Grace met his eyes. There was no anger in hers, only a quiet disappointment he could not understand. "Yes, Mr. Harrington." Richard turned and continued toward the elevators with his executives. As he passed the grand staircase, morning light reflected across the marble and briefly caught the framed portrait of his late wife, Eleanor, hanging near the entrance to the original wing. Richard did not look at it. He had trained himself not to. Years earlier, Eleanor had believed that hospitality began with making people feel seen. Richard now considered such ideas sentimental memories from a smaller life. Behind him, the elderly woman thanked Grace one more time. Grace answered softly, of course. Richard kept walking. He thought he had just corrected an inexperienced employee. He had no idea that the young woman he dismissed so easily would soon remind him why he had built the hotel in the first place. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Harrington Grand at 6:45, 20 minutes before her shift began. Boston was still waking beneath a cold gray sky, and the marble lobby carried the soft echo of rolling suitcases and early footsteps. Grace hung her coat in the employee room, tied back her brown hair, and stepped behind the front desk with the same quiet smile she offered every morning. Before 7:30, she had already helped a business traveler print a missing boarding pass, found a phone charger for a guest whose battery had died, and brought a cup of coffee to Samuel Reed, the 68-year-old doorman who had been working outside in the cold. "You are going to spoil me," Samuel said. Grace smiled. "It is coffee, Sam. Not a vacation in Hawaii." He laughed, warming his hands around the cup. Grace remembered people. That was simply how she moved through the world. She knew Maria from housekeeping had a daughter starting college in the fall. She knew the night auditor preferred tea instead of coffee. She knew which regular guest needed a room away from the elevators because he slept lightly. None of those details appeared on the hotel's revenue reports, but Grace treated them as if they mattered. Richard Harrington noticed different things. He arrived shortly after 8 in a black sedan, walked through the lobby without slowing, and immediately spotted a flower arrangement that had been placed several inches off-center. Within 5 minutes, he had questioned the occupancy forecast, corrected a manager about staffing costs, and asked why 2 premium suites had remained empty the previous night. Richard was not careless, and he was not cruel for pleasure. He was disciplined, intelligent, and relentlessly efficient. Those qualities had helped turn the Harrington name into a symbol of luxury. But somewhere along the way, efficiency had become the only language he trusted. At 9:15, he crossed the lobby and saw Grace helping a nervous young couple understand a transportation map. They were not staying in one of the expensive suites. They had booked the least costly room available and were trying to reach a hospital across town to visit a relative. Grace wrote down the simplest route and called ahead to confirm where their ride should drop them off. "Thank you," the woman said. "We did not know who else to ask." "You are all set," Grace replied. "I hope everything goes well today." Richard watched from several yards away. When the couple left, he approached. "How long did that take?" Grace looked at him. "About 4 minutes. For minutes you could have spent checking arrivals. The arrivals are already checked." Richard glanced at the computer, almost disappointed to find she was right. "You cannot personally solve every guest's problem, Miss Miller." "I know. Then why? Do you keep trying?" Grace considered the question. "Because sometimes a small problem feels very large when you are the person having it." Richard said nothing. For one brief moment, something in her answer reached a place he had spent years keeping closed. Then his expression hardened again. "Just remember your priorities." He walked toward the executive elevators. Grace watched him leave, then returned to her work. Upstairs, Richard entered his private office overlooking Boston Harbor. The room was immaculate, dark wood, leather chairs, financial reports arranged perfectly across his desk. Near the window stood a silver frame containing a photograph of Richard many years younger beside Eleanor, both smiling in front of the first small hotel they had owned together. Eleanor's hand rested on his shoulder. Richard looked at the photograph longer than he intended. He remembered her once telling him that people rarely remembered perfect rooms, but they always remembered how someone made them feel. His jaw tightened. He turned the frame face down and opened the morning revenue report. Downstairs, Grace was greeting another guest by name. 3 days later, Grace stood outside the guest relations office holding a thin folder against her chest. She had applied for an open position there 2 weeks earlier, encouraged by Laura Bennett, the department manager, who had watched Grace handle difficult guests with unusual patience. The new role would mean better pay, more responsibility, and the chance to do the kind of work Grace already found herself doing whenever someone needed help beyond a room key or a reservation number. Laura invited her inside with a warm smile. "You have excellent guest feedback, Grace. Your attendance is strong, and several department heads mentioned you by name." Grace sat across from her, trying not to look too hopeful. "Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity." Laura opened the folder. "There is one final approval." Before Grace could ask what that meant, the office door opened. Richard Harrington entered with a tablet in one hand. Grace's shoulders became slightly still. Richard noticed her immediately. "Miss Miller." "Mr. Harrington." Laura gestured toward the empty chair. "Richard, we were discussing the guest relations opening." He remained standing. "And? Grace is my preferred candidate." Richard looked from Laura to Grace. "Why?" The question was so blunt that Laura paused. "Because she is good with people." "That is not enough." Grace lowered her hands into her lap. Laura continued carefully. "Her guest satisfaction comments are among the strongest on the front desk team." Richard finally sat down. "Guest relations handles complaints, premium accounts, executive travelers, and situations where emotions can become expensive. It requires judgment, authority, and the ability to say no." He looked directly at Grace. Miss Miller, what would you do if a guest demanded something the hotel could not reasonably provide? I would explain what we could do and try to understand what they actually needed. Richard leaned back. You see? That is exactly my concern. Grace frowned slightly. I am not sure I understand. You are too focused on making people feel comfortable. Laura glanced at him. This is hospitality. Hospitality is not unlimited accommodation, Richard replied. We run a business. Grace took a quiet breath. I understand that. Richard's eyes narrowed. Do you? Grace met his gaze. I do not think caring about someone means giving them everything they ask for. Then what does it mean? Making sure they feel seen while you tell them what is possible. The room became silent. Laura's expression softened, but Richard did not move. Something about Grace's answer irritated him because it sounded painfully familiar. Eleanor used to speak that way. She had once told him that a guest could forgive a problem faster than they could forgive being treated as if they did not matter. Richard pushed the memory away. You care too much about being liked, he said. Grace's face changed, not dramatically, but enough for Laura to notice. No, sir, Grace answered. I care about people feeling seen. Richard looked toward the window. Boston traffic moved far below, indifferent and constant. That is not the same thing as running a business. He closed the folder. I am not approving the transfer. Grace stared at the folder for 1 second before standing. I understand. Laura started to speak, but Grace gave her a small, reassuring smile. Thank you for considering me. She walked back into the lobby with her posture straight, though disappointment followed every step. 20 minutes later, Richard came downstairs and saw Grace helping a family whose reservation had been entered incorrectly. She could have handed the problem to someone else. Instead, she listened, found an available room, and reassured the exhausted parents that everything had been handled. When they thanked her, Grace smiled exactly as she had before the meeting. Richard watched from beside the elevators. He had just denied her the job because he believed kindness made her too soft. Yet standing there, he began to wonder why rejection had not made her kindness disappear. By Friday evening, the Harrington Grand was nearly full. A medical conference had brought hundreds of visitors into Boston, and the lobby moved with the constant rhythm of rolling luggage, elevator bells, quiet conversations, and employees crossing the marble floor. Grace had been on her feet for almost 8 hours when Margaret Collins approached the front desk carrying a small brown suitcase and a folded wool coat. She was in her late 60s, plainly dressed, with silver hair and the tired expression of someone who had spent most of the day traveling. Good evening, Grace said. Welcome to the Harrington Grand. How can I help you? Margaret handed her a printed confirmation. I believe I have a reservation. Grace searched the system, then searched again. Nothing appeared. Would you mind giving me a moment? Margaret nodded. Behind her, several guests were already waiting. Another employee leaned toward Grace. We are sold out except for 2 premium rooms. Grace checked the confirmation carefully. Margaret had booked weeks earlier through a partner service, but the reservation had never transferred properly into the hotel system. I am sorry, Mrs. Collins. There appears to have been an error between the booking service and our system. Margaret's face fell. I see. She did not complain. That somehow made Grace feel worse. Please let me see what I can do. 10 minutes passed. Grace called reservations, checked recent cancellations, and finally found a standard room that had been temporarily blocked for maintenance, but had been cleared earlier that afternoon. Before she could assign it, Richard crossed the lobby with 2 senior managers. He noticed the growing line. Miss Miller, what is delaying check-in? Grace explained quickly. Richard looked at Margaret's confirmation. Third-party reservation? Yes, sir. Then the booking service is responsible. Margaret lowered her eyes. Grace remained calm. We have a cleared room available. Richard glanced at the screen. That room was held from inventory. Maintenance approved it this afternoon. Richard's expression tightened. And you have spent 10 minutes solving a problem that did not originate with us while other guests are waiting. Several people in line could hear him. Grace felt the familiar warmth rise into her cheeks. She has nowhere else arranged for tonight. Richard looked at her as though she had just confirmed everything he believed about her. This is exactly what we discussed. You cannot turn every inconvenience into a personal mission. The lobby seemed suddenly quieter. Margaret looked uncomfortable. Grace could have stepped aside. Instead, she said softly, "The room is ready, and the reservation was paid for. I can finish this in less than 2 minutes." Richard stared at her, then gave a restrained nod. 2 minutes. Grace completed the check-in, handed Margaret the key card, and asked Samuel to help with her suitcase. Margaret leaned closer before leaving. "You did not have to do all that." Grace smiled. "You came here expecting a room. You should have one." Margaret studied her face for a moment. "What is your name?" "Grace Miller." "Grace," Margaret repeated quietly, as if she intended to remember it. Later that night, Grace passed through the lobby carrying fresh towels for a guest when she noticed Margaret standing near the original wing. The older woman was staring at the framed portrait of Eleanor Harrington. Her face had gone completely still. Grace approached carefully. "Mrs. Collins, are you all right?" Margaret did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's photograph. Then she whispered, "I have not seen that face in 22 years. Grace looked from Margaret to the portrait. "You knew Mrs. Harrington?" Margaret slowly reached into her handbag. "Knew her?" She pulled out an old photograph and held it beneath the lobby light. 3 younger people stood outside a modest hotel entrance: Margaret, Eleanor, and a smiling Richard Harrington. "She was my best friend." Grace stared at the photograph beneath the warm lobby light. Richard looked almost unrecognizable, not because he was younger, but because he was smiling without restraint. Eleanor stood beside him with one arm linked through Margaret's, while behind them was a modest brick hotel with a narrow entrance and 2 flower boxes beneath the windows. "That was their first place," Margaret said softly. 24 rooms, 1 unreliable elevator, and a front desk bell that barely worked. Grace smiled. "Mr. Harrington does not talk about those days." Margaret looked toward Eleanor's portrait. "I imagine he does not." Before Grace could ask more, the lobby doors opened and a sharp gust of winter air swept inside. Snow had begun falling heavily across Boston, whitening the sidewalks beyond the glass. Within 20 minutes, phones started ringing. Flights at Logan International Airport were being delayed and canceled, and travelers began arriving faster than the front desk could process them. Grace carefully returned the photograph. "Keep it for now," Margaret said. "You may understand it better after tonight." Grace barely had time to consider the words. By 9:30, the lobby was crowded with stranded travelers. Every available room was being claimed, ride services were delayed, and several restaurants nearby had closed early because of the storm. Richard appeared from the executive elevators with Laura and 2 managers, immediately taking control. "Confirm every remaining room. No complimentary upgrades without authorization. Keep the entrance clear and move waiting guests toward the lounge." His instructions were efficient, but the tension continued. Rising. Grace noticed Margaret sitting alone near the fireplace, holding her phone with both hands. She stepped away during a brief opening. "Is everything all right?" Margaret shook her head. "My daughter was supposed to pick me up tomorrow morning, but she is outside Worcester tonight. I cannot reach her now." Grace checked the weather alerts. Roads west of Boston were deteriorating quickly. "You are safe here tonight. Let us try her again in a few minutes." Margaret gave a worried smile. "You have enough people to take care of." Grace pulled a chair closer. "You are one of them." She arranged hot tea from the restaurant and asked Samuel to check whether Margaret needed anything from her suitcase. Richard noticed from across the lobby. His expression tightened, but before he could approach, a manager called him toward the reservation desk. Nearly an hour passed before Richard finally saw Margaret clearly. He stopped in the middle of a sentence. The color seemed to leave his face. "Margaret." She slowly stood. For the first time since Grace had known him, Richard Harrington looked uncertain. Margaret held the old photograph against her coat. "Hello, Richard." The lobby noise seemed to recede around them. Richard glanced at the photograph and immediately recognized it. "Where did you get that?" Margaret gave him a sad smile. "I have carried it for more than 20 years. Richard looked toward Eleanor's portrait, then away. Why are you here? I came to Boston for a family visit. I did not know this was your hotel until tonight. His eyes moved to Grace. She helped you. More than once. Richard said nothing. Margaret studied the man her old friend had loved. Eleanor would have liked her. The sentence struck harder than any accusation could have. Richard's joy tightened. You do not know her. Margaret looked toward Grace, who was already helping another stranded traveler find a place to sit. Perhaps not. But I knew Eleanor. Richard turned toward the windows, where snow now covered the street beneath the hotel lights. Margaret stepped closer and lowered her voice. Do you remember what she used to say about this business? Richard remained silent. People may forget the room, Margaret said, but they remember whether someone made them feel that they mattered. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. He had heard those words before, years earlier, in a tiny hotel with a broken front desk bell. When he opened them again, Grace was kneeling beside an exhausted elderly guest, patiently explaining that a warm meal was on its way. For the first time, Richard did not see an employee wasting time. He saw Eleanor. For several seconds, Richard said nothing. Snow pressed against the tall lobby windows while stranded travelers filled every chair, every sofa, and nearly every open corner of the Harrington Grand. Margaret's words remained with him, but there was no time to answer them. Laura hurried across the marble floor holding a tablet. Richard, we have another problem. The shuttle company suspended service, and at least 30 guests are still trying to get here from Logan. Richard immediately turned toward her. Contact every private transportation company in the city. We already have. Most are unavailable. His phone rang before he could respond. He glanced at the screen and froze. The call was from his younger sister, Catherine, who lived outside Boston. He answered quickly. Catherine? Her voice was strained. Their 79-year-old father, William, had been visiting her for dinner when the storm worsened. His scheduled ride home had been canceled, and Catherine's neighborhood had lost power. She wanted to bring him into the city, but road conditions were deteriorating. Richard looked toward the windows. Stay where you are until I arrange something. He ended the call and immediately began making calls of his own. Driver after driver was unavailable. For the first time that night, the man who always seemed to have an answer had none. Grace noticed him standing near the executive elevators, staring at his phone. Mr. Harrington? He looked up. Not now, Miss Miller. She almost walked away, then saw something unfamiliar in his face. It was not irritation. It was worry. Is someone in trouble? Richard hesitated. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have told her it was none of her concern. Instead, he said, My father is stranded outside the city. Grace nodded. Where? Newton. My sister is with him, but their power is out. Grace thought for a moment. Samuel's nephew works for a medical transportation company. They have vehicles equipped for winter conditions. Richard looked at her skeptically. How do you know that? Samuel mentioned it last month when his wife had an appointment. Grace found the doorman near the entrance. Within minutes, Samuel was calling his nephew. One vehicle was available nearby, but company policy required confirmation that the trip was safe before dispatch. Grace helped Catherine provide the address and necessary details while Richard stood beside her, unusually silent. 20 minutes later, the ride was confirmed. Richard stared at the message on his phone. They can bring both of them here. Grace smiled. Good. Why did you help me? The question surprised her. Your father needed help. Richard looked at her for a long moment. It was almost the same answer she had given him days earlier in the lobby, the answer he had dismissed as evidence that she did not understand business. Before he could respond, raised voices came from the front desk. A reservation system slowdown had created a growing line of frustrated travelers. Laura was handling one side while another employee struggled to answer questions. Grace immediately moved toward them. Richard followed. What are you doing? Helping. Your shift ended almost an hour ago. Grace glanced around the crowded lobby. They're overwhelmed. Richard watched as she organized the waiting guests into groups, separating those with confirmed reservations from those seeking rooms. She asked the restaurant to prepare hot coffee and simple meals for people waiting in the lounge. She arranged extra blankets for travelers who might need to remain downstairs until transportation became available. She never raised her voice. She never reminded anyone that she had been denied a promotion 3 days earlier. And when Richard gave an instruction that made sense, she followed it without resentment. Gradually, the noise softened. The line shortened. People who had arrived angry began sitting down. Shortly after midnight, Richard received a message from Catherine. She and their father were safely on their way. He looked across the lobby at Grace, who was handing a cup of tea to Margaret. Richard had spent years believing authority was what kept a hotel standing during a crisis. That night, he began to understand that sometimes it was kindness that kept people from falling apart. At 12:45 in the morning, a dark medical transport van finally stopped beneath the hotel entrance lights. Richard was already waiting near the doors when Catherine stepped inside with their father, William Harrington. The older man looked tired but relieved, wrapped in a heavy winter coat while Samuel carefully took his overnight bag. Richard crossed the lobby immediately. "Dad, are you all right?" William nodded. "I am fine. Your sister worried enough for both of us." Catherine gave Richard a tired smile. "The driver was wonderful. I still cannot believe you found someone tonight." Richard looked across the lobby. Grace was helping a stranded couple arrange a morning train after their flight had been cancelled. "I did not," he said quietly. Catherine followed his gaze. "Who is she?" Richard did not answer immediately. "An employee." William studied his son's expression. "Then she must be a good one." Richard looked away. Hours earlier, he would have responded with a qualification, some comment about boundaries or efficiency. Now the words would not come. By 1:30, the worst of the confusion had passed. Travelers with rooms had checked in, those without rooms had blankets and warm drinks in the lounge, and the front desk had finally stopped ringing every few seconds. Grace was gathering abandoned coffee cups when Richard approached her. "Miss Miller." She straightened. "Yes, Mr. Harrington? My father and sister arrived safely." Grace smiled. "I am glad. Samuel told me you contacted his nephew." Samuel made the call. "Because you remembered something he told you a month ago." Grace shrugged gently. "It seemed useful." Richard stared at her. "You could have gone home hours ago." "So could a lot of people." "That is not an answer." Grace glanced toward the crowded lounge. People were scared, tired, and stuck somewhere they did not expect to be. Leaving did not feel right. Richard's voice lowered. "After I rejected your transfer?" Grace understood what he was really asking. "Those guests did not reject my transfer." Richard had no response. Margaret, sitting near the fireplace, watched from a distance. Grace picked up another empty cup, but Richard stopped her with a question. "Do you ever get tired of helping people who might not appreciate it?" Grace considered this longer. "Sometimes." "Then why keep doing it?" "Because appreciation is not the reason to be kind." Richard's face became still. Grace continued before she could reconsider. "If I only helped people who treated me perfectly, then my kindness would belong to them, not to me." The words landed somewhere deeper than Richard expected. He looked toward his father, now resting comfortably beside Catherine. Then he looked at Margaret, at Eleanor's portrait, and finally back at Grace. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "You have done enough tonight." Grace gave a small nod. "Good night, Mr. Harrington." As she walked toward the employee hallway, Margaret approached him. "She reminds you of Eleanor." Richard did not deny it this time. "Eleanor believed everyone deserved more of me than I knew how to give." Margaret shook her head. "No. She believed you had more to give." Richard looked at the portrait across the lobby. For years, grief had allowed him to tell himself that becoming harder was the price of surviving loss. He had built more hotels, earned more money, and demanded more perfection, until almost nothing remained of the young man smiling in Margaret's photograph. "I thought if I kept moving," he said, "I would stop missing her." Margaret's eyes softened. "Did it work?" Richard looked around the magnificent lobby bearing his family name. "No," Margaret placed the old photograph in his hand. "Then perhaps it is time to stop running." Richard remained there long after she walked away. Outside, the snow was finally beginning to slow. Inside, he turned toward Eleanor's portrait and, for the first time in years, did not look away. Morning arrived slowly. Over Boston, turning the snow outside the Harrington Grand from gray to pale gold. Inside, the lobby looked nothing like the elegant space Richard normally inspected at 7 each morning. Blankets rested across lounge chairs, coffee cups covered side tables, exhausted travelers slept beneath borrowed coats, and employees moved quietly between them. Yet there was something Richard could not ignore. Despite the storm, despite the canceled flights and overcrowded lobby, the hotel felt strangely human. Grace returned shortly after 7, even though Laura had told her she could come in later. Richard watched her enter wearing the same simple light blue blouse beneath her winter coat. She greeted Samuel, checked on Margaret, asked about William, then walked behind the front desk as though the previous night had required nothing extraordinary from her. At 8:30, Richard asked Laura to gather the available staff in the main conference room. Grace assumed the meeting concerned the storm response. She chose a seat near the end of the table. Richard stood at the front holding no tablet, no financial report, and no prepared notes. That alone made several managers exchange uncertain looks. Last night exposed weaknesses in our emergency procedures, he began. We will review those later. He paused. But it exposed something else first. His eyes found Grace. 3 days ago, I rejected Miss Miller's application for guest relations. Grace became still. Laura looked toward her. Richard continued. I told her she was too focused on making people comfortable. I told her she cared too much about being liked. And I suggested that kindness could interfere with professionalism. The room was completely silent. I was wrong. Grace looked up sharply. Richard had apologized privately to executives before. He had corrected business decisions. But admitting a personal failure in front of employees was something almost no one in that room had witnessed. Last night, he continued, Miss Miller helped organize this hotel when our systems and procedures were under extraordinary pressure. She helped stranded guests without asking what kind of room they had booked. She stayed beyond her shift without being told. She found transportation for my father when I could not. Richard's voice softened. And she helped me after I had given her every reason not to. Grace lowered her eyes for a moment. Richard looked around the table. Yesterday, I believed she was too soft for hospitality. What I saw last night reminded me that hospitality without humanity is simply a transaction. Laura smiled faintly. Richard turned back to Grace. Miss Miller, I owe you an apology. Grace stood slowly. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I also owe you something else. He glanced toward Laura. If the position is still available, I am approving your transfer to guest relations. Laura did not hesitate. It is available. A few employees smiled, but Grace remained quiet. Richard seemed almost puzzled. You do not look surprised. Grace gave him a small smile. I am surprised. Then what is it? She chose her words carefully. I appreciate the position. But what you said before that matters more. Richard understood. The promotion could correct a professional decision. It could not erase how he had treated her. Only change could do that. After the meeting, Richard returned to his office and found Margaret waiting near the doorway. She carried her suitcase and the old photograph. My daughter is coming for me, she said. Richard nodded. I am glad. Margaret placed the photograph on his desk beside Eleanor's silver frame, which was no longer face down. You remembered something last night. Richard looked at Eleanor's smiling face. I remembered who we wanted to be. Margaret shook her head gently. No, Richard. You remembered who you still can be. Downstairs, Grace was helping an elderly traveler locate a missing scarf. Richard watched from the balcony above the lobby. This time, he did not check his watch. He did not calculate the minutes. He simply watched, and somewhere beneath all the years of grief, discipline, and distance, something in him finally began to soften. 3 months later, winter had loosened its grip on Boston, and sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Harrington Grand with a warmth the lobby had not known in months. Grace now worked in guest relations, but very little about her had changed. She still arrived early, still remembered Samuel's coffee, and still stopped when someone looked lost even if she was already carrying a list of things that needed her attention. What had changed was the hotel around her. Richard had introduced a new staff program named the Eleanor Harrington Hospitality Initiative, designed to give employees greater freedom to assist guests facing unexpected travel problems without wading through layers of approval. He had also begun attending employee meetings without spending the entire time discussing revenue. At first, people assumed the changes would fade. They did not. Richard started learning names. He asked housekeepers what slowed their work instead of simply demanding faster room turnover. He thanked Samuel for staying late during the storm. He even began keeping Eleanor's photograph upright on his office desk. Margaret had returned home, but she occasionally mailed handwritten notes to Grace and Richard. One afternoon, Grace found Richard standing beneath Eleanor's portrait in the original wing. She would have liked the program, Grace said. Richard smiled faintly. She would have told me it took me long enough. Grace laughed. I never met her, but that sounds possible. Richard looked at the portrait. For years, I thought keeping this place successful was how I honored her. I protected the name, the standards, everything we built. His voice became quieter. I did not realize I had protected the building and abandoned part of what made it worth building. Grace did not offer him an easy answer. She simply stood beside him for a moment. Then a noise came from across the lobby. An elderly man near the entrance had accidentally opened the wrong compartment of his suitcase, sending several papers, a scarf, and a pair of glasses onto the marble floor. Grace instinctively started toward him. Richard moved first. He crossed the lobby, bent down, and began gathering the scattered belongings. The man looked embarrassed. I am sorry. These hands are not as steady as they used to be. There is nothing to apologize for, Richard said. He handed back the glasses and carefully closed the suitcase. Grace stopped several feet away, watching. Richard noticed her and stood. For a second, neither spoke. Then Grace smiled. You left what you were doing. Richard glanced toward the elderly man, who was now heading toward the elevators. Months earlier, Richard would have explained the difference between an owner and a front desk employee. He might have mentioned efficiency, responsibilities, or professional boundaries. Instead, he gave Grace a small smile. He needed help. Grace's eyes softened. Those 3 words carried the entire distance he had traveled. Richard looked around the lobby that had once seemed to him like a collection of rooms, employees, costs, and paying guests. Now he noticed Samuel opening the door for a tired family. He noticed Laura kneeling beside a traveler's suitcase to explain a luggage tag. He noticed 2 employees helping a guest find a pharmacy. None of those moments appeared on a balance sheet. Yet for the first time in years, Richard understood why they mattered. The Harrington name still stood in polished brass above the entrance, and the hotel was still successful. But its greatest change could not be measured in occupancy rates or revenue. It lived in the way people were treated when nobody important seemed to be watching. Grace had never tried to defeat Richard, embarrass him, or prove that she was better than he was. She had simply refused to let his hardness decide what kind of person she would become. And in doing so, she reminded him of the man he had once been. The hotel had always carried Richard Harrington's name, but because of one simple girl, it finally carried Eleanor's heart again.